When you strip away the carefully timed histrionics and just look at the language, Wendi Adelson's initial police interview reveals a cunning predator initiating the next sequence of events in a carefully constructed plan. Hi everybody, it's Chris from Guilty Words, where we unravel crime one word at a time. Wendi Adelson first met with the police on the day Dan Markel was shot, when they brought her to the station to inform her about the incident. It was the only voluntary interview, and the only one without a lawyer present. The entire encounter was about 5 hours long, including time with the victim's advocate. Tonight we're going to look at Wendy's agenda, the information she deliberately emphasized, and the information she tried to glean from the police. While we're at it, we'll take note of some bizarre statements and theorize what the motive might be behind them. Let's take a look at it all together. Wendy had 4 major areas she wanted to cover when she was speaking with the police, as proven by the amount of statements she made about each of these and what she said. The first was to vilify Dan, to convince the police that he was someone that people would want to shoot, just not her. To find out if she was a suspect, to present herself as innocent and scared, and to also helpfully provide other suspects, with her brother Charlie at the top of the list. Although you may be familiar with the case, let's just briefly review what Wendy did the morning Dan Markel was shot. The TV repairman came over and she repeated to him Charlie's awful joke about buying a TV instead of hiring a hitman. Then she said she worked on some papers, and Dan texted her a little bit after 9 o'clock to set up a meeting for later in the day. She drove out to get bourbon for a party that night, and she just happened to drive past 4 liquor stores to take a shortcut down her old street. She had lunch with friends. That's where the police found her, and they did assure her at the restaurant that her kids were okay. And then she reached the police station, where she spent the next 5 hours or so, speaking with the police and a victim's advocate. The first thing Wendy clearly wanted to do was to make sure the police knew that Dan Markel was a man that had enemies. But she didn't want to be too obvious about it. She didn't want to paint him as the ogre or tyrant that she had painted him to her family and friends, because she didn't want to appear to be too vengeful and have too sharp a spotlight on her actions. So she damned him with faint praise. She talked about him with juxtaposition, where she always talked about a good thing-ish about him right up against something unpleasant. Let me show you what I mean. He had friends. He always meant well, but he would sometimes rub people the wrong way. He owes money to me, the police had asked if he owed money to anyone. And then she added, but not me, in terms of I didn't shoot him. I know a lot of people who didn't love him. I don't know anyone who would do something like this. He meant well. Everyone that knew him, he means well, but he can be a little argumentative. But he didn't owe anyone money. He didn't do anything except work and take care of his kids. He wasn't involved in anything bad, good and evil, in the same statement. What I meant by that is that Danny didn't treat me very well, and I'm scared that maybe someone did this, not because they hate Danny, but because they thought this was good somehow. He and I got along for the sake of the kids. I found him hard to be around, but so did a lot of people. He never hurt me physically, but he was emotionally abusive. I didn't tell most people, other than my family. He told everyone around the community that I was mentally ill. He's challenging. He loves to argue. The students felt put down by him a lot, so they felt insecure. But again, we're not talking about hateful and awful. We're talking about difficult. And this is when she was talking about Dan with her boyfriend Jeff, and he made a recommendation to her, and he said, what if you asked the parenting coordinator to only have emails 2 times a week instead of all day long every day, 5 days a week? When he first started dating Amy, he would Skype from bed with Amy. It's really messed up that people hear gunshots on Trescott and they think something happened to me. I guess it makes sense that with the divorce, and people do crazy things. What a portrait to paint of this man. Oh, I'm not really saying anything bad about him. I'm just saying these negative things over and over and over again. But in addition to wanting to paint Dan as an ogre, she also was incredibly insistent that he would not have committed suicide. 6 times she emphasized this right from the beginning all the way through the end of the 5 hours. Let's listen to what she has to say.
He wouldn't do this to himself.
Okay.
He was a very positive person. He wouldn't do this to himself. He has a girlfriend now. So there's no way that he did this because he had all kinds of plans. Do it to himself. There's no way he did it. He never really got depressed. He never got that sad. You know, like he was a really positive guy. It wasn't him.
Which is why I said to the officer, there's no way he did this to himself. Like 0 chance that he shot himself.
I know, there's just, I mean, given his personality and everything, there's no way that he did this.
No, he didn't do this. So somebody did.
And I asked myself, why was she so insistent that he didn't kill himself? The police had never suggested that was even an option right from the very beginning. And I thought, well, maybe there's insurance involved. And if any of you know, please let me know in the comments below if she was due to inherit any kind of insurance from his death that would have been voided if he had committed suicide. But then I realized when she was talking to Donna that she thought he had been killed inside the house. And she wanted to make sure the police knew it wasn't suicide, so they would go ahead and investigate and find the person who did this. Ideally, her family.
And in his house, I know.
The police never said he was shot in his house or in the driveway. They didn't give any details at all. So I wonder if something in the original plan included them invading the house and shooting him, but they found him in the driveway instead. And why she would assume he was shot in his house. He could have been shot in the street. Why did she assume it was inside his house? Wendy's next item on her agenda is to find out if the police suspect her. And so what she does is cheesy reverse psychology. She keeps saying, I know you must think I'm a suspect, to see if they deny it. And they do, much to my surprise. But they also test her for gunshot residue and search her van. But let's look at the number of times she keeps asking or suggesting that she's a suspect to see how they'll react. Wendy says, no, he owes money to me. The officer says he owes money to you, and she starts crying. But not me. I didn't do it. Did you need to read me my Miranda rights if you're going to look at my phone? I couldn't tell when you were talking to me in the car if I was a suspect. She's a lawyer. She knows when Miranda rights are read, and she wants to know if they're going to be read to her because she's a suspect, not because they're going to look at her phone. I'm a suspect? I understand why you would think I was a suspect. I guess I'm not a suspect. I understand why you would think I would do this. Obviously, I would be one of the people that they would think did it. I'm going to go to the bathroom and come back. Am I a suspect? Do you need to watch me? And keep in mind, by now, we're 4 hours into the interview, and they have told her numerous times she's not a suspect. As he was driving me here, I'm like, oh my God, I wonder if I could be framed for something, like I didn't do something, but I'm still going to end up in jail. Now, of all these statements, there are 2 that are incredibly significant. The first is this one. I couldn't tell when you were talking to me in the car if I was a suspect. And the next is the one where she was talking to her friend at the end. As he was driving me here, I'm like, oh my God, I wonder if I could be framed for something if I didn't do something, but I'm still going to end up in jail. Let's take a moment and talk about each of those. The reason I find these 2 statements so significant is because of when they occurred. They occurred in the police car after they had picked her up at the restaurant where she was lunching with her friends and were taking her to the station to inform her what had happened to Dan. They had told her at the restaurant that her kids were okay, but they hadn't told her what had happened to Dan, just that it involved him. Most people would figure accident, heart attack, robbery, and since she'd been past the street that day and thought that a tree was down, maybe he'd gotten injured at home somehow. But notice what she's thinking in the car. I couldn't tell when you were talking to me in the car if I was a suspect. A suspect for what? As he was driving me here, the police officer, I'm like, oh my God, I wonder if I could be like framed for something, like if I didn't do something, but I'm still going to end up in jail. Why is she making that leap of logic from something's happened to your ex-husband to I'm going to be framed for something? That's not usually where our mind goes. Because keep in mind, she hadn't been told yet that Dan was shot. They didn't tell her that till she was at the police station. So why is she so worried about being a suspect or being framed unless she knew that Dan had been shot? Wendy also has a maniac on the loose theme that she hammers all throughout her time with the police. When they first inform her about the shooting, they say, what we've seen so far is that someone intentionally hurt Danny. She starts crying hysterically and asks, you don't know who it is? Because of course she wants to know if they think it's her. The officer says no, and she says, what if they come after the boys? She keeps saying she's afraid that someone who would hurt Danny would immediately go after his kids as well. The police keep reassuring her that they don't see any evidence of that, but she's inconsolable. She actually brings this idea up 10 times throughout the interview. And I kept thinking, why is she pounding this drum so much? And the reason may be twofold. One is, if she's terrified of a maniac, then it means she knows nothing about this and she must be innocent. And the other is it makes her appear a loving, caring mother who's afraid for her children and wants to protect them. What's interesting is after a whole afternoon of being told, we think you're safe, why don't you stay at a friend's just to have some support tonight? We don't think there's a maniac coming for your children. She says to the victim's advocate, how come they aren't worried about my safety? And notice she says my safety, not my children's safety. Why is that? I'm not saying they don't care about me, but they don't seem to be worried about, and then the victim's advocate steps in and says some soothing words about how they do investigations. But Wendy seems disappointed that they're not taking this bait about how scared she is. Next, Wendy wants to be incredibly helpful by providing some convenient suspects. And she starts with Charlie and her family, and then a few other people, just so it's not too obvious that she's pointing them out. I'm going to play a clip from the interview, and I've trimmed down a lot of the histrionics and cut out some of the extraneous talking, so we just hear the meat of what she says about Charlie and her family. And I want to take a close look at how she describes her relationship with Charlie.
I do. What I meant by it is that Danny didn't treat me very well, and I'm so scared that maybe someone did this. Not because they hate Danny, but because they thought this was good somehow.
Would you ever ask someone to do something like this?
Not in a million years.
Do you think someone would do this for your benefit without asking you?
No.
What good does it serve?
I made my brother, the one, his name is Charlie, the one I'm really close to, he makes a lot of jokes in bad taste, and it was a joke he made. He bought the TV for me this morning that got broken. I looked into hiring a hitman, and it was cheaper to get you this TV. I mean, he would never. He's my big brother, and he's been taking care of me since I was little, but he would never. But even my family, who felt like I had been mistreated, would never do something like this. Never.
Again, the juxtaposition of, oh, he'd never do it, with, he made this joke about a hitman. But in addition, this idea of Charlie as protector. He's my big brother, and he's been taking care of me since I was little. Usually, we say our parents take care of us when we're little, not our older brothers or sisters. They may watch out for us. But taking care of me is a much stronger phrase. And also notice the verb tense here. He's been taking care of me since I was little, meaning it's continuing to go on, not he took care of me when we were kids. Because right now they're both adults, and why he would still be taking care of her is doubtful. But yet somehow he is still taking care of her. So, sorry about the cat. So would that include hiring a hitman? Because he made this joke. And then, oddly, she brings in her entire family. Why? But even my family, who felt like I had been mistreated, by the way, and also knew about the psychological abuse that I didn't share with other people, they would never do something like this, never. But she's planted the seed of Charlie and her family, and that's what she wanted to do. Besides Charlie, Wendy suggests that Dan's girlfriend, Amy, has an ex-husband who might be fanatically jealous and did this. Or her boyfriend, Jeff, might have done it. I find these two choices very interesting. I don't think Wendy seriously wanted to set up Amy's ex as a plan B for who to blame for the murder. She happens to mention that she had asked her girlfriend about Amy. She'd gone online and looked Amy up. She gave a lot of descriptions about Amy, Amy's brother, where Amy spent the weekend, things you wouldn't find from a casual Google search. She had done some serious internet stalking of Amy. And if there was any jealousy involved, what better way to cause Amy some trouble than to have the police show up and start questioning her ex-husband about whether or not he shot her current boyfriend. Jeff, I think, was a more viable plan B in case she didn't get it pinned on Charlie. What's interesting is towards the end of the interview, when they start focusing more on Jeff, she starts distancing and saying, well, he was really more jealous of this other guy, and not so much Danny. And really, I talked to him about Danny because he was a therapist and he gave me lots of good advice. So she does some backpedaling when they show a whole lot of interest in Jeff, because that's not where she wants their main focus to be, although she doesn't dismiss him entirely. Close to the end of the interview time, when she's with her friend and the victim's advocate, Wendy says something really interesting. She says, I feel like either Amy's ex-husband did this or somebody did this on my behalf. Some crazy deranged person thought this was a good way to support me, and that's why I feel responsible. Unless it was something to do with Amy, and then I don't feel responsible. Why would she assume, when she had already been divorced for 2 years, that suddenly someone would get angry enough on her behalf that they would do this? She says she doesn't know what's going on in Dan's life in the last 2 years when they ask her, does he have any enemies? So why does she leap to the conclusion that she has some vengeful protector who's trying to help her out, unbeknownst to her? And all of a sudden, again, it's an odd leap to assume that she's the center of the universe, and that's why Dan was killed. But she's right. There's a very odd communication problem about whether or not Wendy understands that Dan is still alive. And I can't quite iron this out. The officer clearly tells her right at the beginning that Dan has been shot, is in the hospital, and is not expected to survive. And she goes into massive hysterical crying. And she asks a couple of questions. Is he still in the hospital? Is he alone? Does anyone know he's there? I thought it was odd that if she was this hysterically upset about it, that she didn't say, oh my goodness, I have to run and be with him, and I have to grab my kids and go be with him. Instead, she was asking, is he alone, and does anyone know he's there? It could be she's so upset about the thought of this that she doesn't want him to be alone when he's hurt and upset, in which case, why isn't she out the door if that bothers her that much? But another interpretation is he alone? Meaning, is anyone with him who might hear him say something about what happened? Should I be worried? I think this is more of a fact-finding question. But it gets a little convoluted later in the interview when she's with the victim's advocate. The victim advocate is listening to Wendy talk about how she's struggling with how she's going to tell her children that Dan has died. And she clarifies that Dan is still alive. And Wendy said she didn't realize that the officer implied that he was dead, which is not true. And I don't know if Wendy was focusing so much on her other agenda items that she skipped ahead to her rehearsed, here's what I'm going to say because Dan is dead thing, or if there was just some genuine confusion. Let me know what you think in the comments below. But when the victim advocate explained that Dan was still alive, then finally the more unscripted reaction comes in. First of all, she wants to know how he got to the hospital. Did he call 911? She's trying to find out, even though they've explained to her that he's seriously injured, not going to survive, did he call 911? She wants to know how conscious he was, how coherent he was. Should I bring the kids to see him? Danny's not waking up? She asks a version of this 4 times, even though they have explained the extent of his injuries to her. Will they tell me if he dies? She wants to make sure she knows when it happens. And lastly, I just want to cover a few pointed questions and odd statements that Wendy made in this interview. The first was, do you know who it is? Trying to pry more information from the police to see if she's a suspect. Wendy says, I have a lot of friends, and the officer says, I know, and she snaps back with, how do you know that? Very clear and very pointed. She wants to know if they've been investigating her. We would usually think, oh, because he thinks I'm a nice person. Not Wendy. And the officer also says, well, you got a lunch date last minute. And she's like, last minute? Again, how do you know it was last minute? Have they been checking up on her? She also mentions a couple of times, how did they find out where I was? How did they find out where she was having lunch is what she's asking. And she doesn't get an answer to that, and she really wants one. When she calls her mother Donna, after she hangs up, she asks the victim advocate, could you hear her? Now, she has called other people and hasn't asked that question, but she wanted to know if what her mother said was overheard. They are going to think I did it. This is when she's talking about Dan Markel's parents. This is a bizarre and eerie echo to Sarah Boone when she was standing outside with the police and telling them that George's family was going to think she did it. Very creepy echo. When she's speaking to her mother Donna, she says, could you tell Charlie I don't feel like talking? Interesting, because she's already been asking, well, should I call my friends and cancel my party for tonight? Should I call and cancel the play dates? What can I tell people? What shouldn't I tell people? She's already made a few calls and she's planning a few more, but she doesn't want to call Charlie, especially from the police station when they're listening in. She says she'll call him later and tells her mom to do that. So what conclusions can we draw? In my opinion, Wendy knew perfectly well what she was being called to the police station for. She thought he'd been killed in the house the way they had discussed and planned. And she was ready to set Charlie up, throw a few other red herrings there so it didn't look too obvious she was setting Charlie up. She wanted to make sure they knew Dan was a man who would have people who wanted to murder him. She was a woman who had loyal people around her who might consider murdering him, and that she was terrified they were going to come after her children. And even though she knew she must be a suspect, she had nothing to do with it. She knew she'd be interviewed by the police, and she was ready. Wendy is a woman who prepares, and she was prepared. Let me know in the comments below what you think about Wendy's interview. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I know there are a lot of places you could spend your time on YouTube, and I'm honored that you spent some with me. And if you've enjoyed this, please hit the like button, and if you're not a member of our Guilty Words tribe, I'd be honored to have your subscription as well. And until we meet in the next video, please use your words wisely and well. Take care.